She never used spices. She never used salt. Yet once people tasted her food, they became obsessed. What no one knew was that the water she used came from a place no one would ever imagine. And when the truth was finally exposed, the entire village wished they had never eaten a single bite. In the small Nigerian village of Ugwoba, just outside Enugu State, there was a woman named Grace who ran a modest food stall near the main market square. The stall was nothing special, just a wooden table with benches, a few pots over firewood, and a faded umbrella that barely provided shade. Grace had arrived in the village about 8 months earlier, claiming she was a widow from Anambra looking for a fresh start. She kept to herself mostly, didn't attend village meetings, didn't gossip with other women at the borehole. She just cooked, and at first, nobody paid much attention. There were already 5 other food vendors in the market, women who'd been cooking there for years, women with loyal customers and established reputations. Grace was just another face, another pot of rice, another seller trying to make a living. But then something changed. Something nobody could explain, even now. It started small. A few customers wandered over to Grace's stall, probably because her prices were slightly lower, or maybe they were just curious about the new vendor. They'd order a plate of jollof rice or a bowl of pepper soup, eat it, pay, and leave. Nothing unusual. But then those same customers came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Within 2 weeks, Grace's stall had a line. Within a month, it was the longest line in the market. Within 3 months, the other food vendors were sitting idle, watching their customers walk right past them, eyes fixed on Grace's stall like moths drawn to flame. People stopped cooking at home. Wives prepared meals that went untouched. Mothers watched their children push away their plates, complaining that the food tasted wrong, tasted empty, tasted like nothing compared to what Grace made. And the strangest part? Grace never seemed surprised. She never celebrated her success, never thanked her customers, never even smiled much. She just cooked with the same slow, methodical rhythm. Her face blank, her movements precise, like she was performing a ritual rather than running a business. Marcus was one of the first to fall under the spell, though he didn't realize it at the time. He was a mechanic, 42 years old, married in Ngozi for 12 years with 3 children. A good man by all accounts, hardworking, faithful, the kind of husband who came home every evening and played with his kids before dinner. But about 4 months after Grace opened her stall, Marcus began to change. It was subtle at first. He'd come home from work and barely touch Ngozi's cooking. He'd take a few bites, then claim he wasn't hungry, that he'd eaten something earlier. Ngozi didn't think much of it initially. Men sometimes got tired of home cooking, she reasoned. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe business was slow. But then she noticed the pattern. Every single day, Marcus would disappear during his lunch break. His apprentice mentioned seeing him at the market. When Ngozi asked him about it, Marcus became defensive. He said he was just buying food, that there was nothing wrong with eating out occasionally. But it wasn't occasional. It was every day, sometimes twice a day. And the money started disappearing. First from his wallet, then from their savings jar, then from the envelope where they kept money for the children's school fees. Ngozi confronted him one evening after the children were asleep. She asked him directly why he was spending so much money on food, why he couldn't eat what she cooked anymore, why he looked so distant, so distracted all the time. Marcus tried to explain, but his words came out jumbled, desperate. He said her food just didn't taste right anymore, that nothing tasted right except Grace's cooking, that he couldn't help it, that he tried to stop but the craving was too strong. Ngozi stared at her husband, this man she'd known for over a decade, and barely recognized him. His eyes looked hollow. His hands trembled slightly. He looked like someone withdrawing from a drug, except the drug was food, and that made no sense at all. She wanted to be angry, but instead she felt afraid. Because if a man like Marcus, a man with a family and responsibilities and self-control, could become this desperate over a plate of rice, then something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. But Marcus wasn't alone. All across Ugwoba, the same story was playing out in different homes. Teachers were abandoning their classrooms during lunch breaks, leaving students unsupervised just to stand in line at Grace's stall. A civil servant named Chitty spent his entire monthly salary in 2 weeks, then borrowed money from colleagues, all to eat Grace's food. A university student named Oluchi stopped going to lectures, stopped studying, stopped caring about anything except getting to the market before Grace's stall closed for the day. Even Pastor Emeka, the respected head of the village's largest church, a man known for his discipline and his frequent fasting, was seen at Grace's stall every single afternoon, sometimes with a plate in each hand, eating like someone who hadn't seen food in days. The village elders noticed. The women noticed. Everyone noticed. But no one knew what to do. How do you fight an addiction when the source is just food? How do you tell grown adults to stop eating at a particular stall without sounding ridiculous? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The breaking point came when fights started breaking out at the market. Not arguments, actual physical fights. Two men, both regulars at Grace's stall, nearly killed each other over who was next in line. One of them, a man named Tund, claimed he'd been waiting for 20 minutes. The other, a trader named Emeka, said he'd been there first. Words were exchanged. Shoving started. Then punches. By the time other vendors pulled them apart, both men were bleeding. And Grace just stood there stirring her pot, watching with that same unreadable expression, like violence at her stall was as ordinary as rain. The market chairman tried to intervene. He suggested that Grace implement a number system, a proper queue, something to manage the crowd. Grace nodded politely, but never actually did it. The chaos continued. People began arriving earlier, some as early as 5 in the morning, just to secure their spot in line. They'd wait for hours, missing work, missing family obligations, sitting in the dust and heat with empty plates in their laps. Their eyes fixed on Grace's stall, their bodies tense with anticipation. Ngozi couldn't take it anymore. She watched her husband deteriorate day by day, watched him become a stranger, and she knew she had to do something. So she went to Grace's stall herself. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sun high and merciless, the market buzzing with activity. Ngozi joined the line, feeling the eyes of other women on her, women who knew she was Marcus's wife, women who probably pitted her or judged her or both. When she finally reached the front, Grace looked at her with mild interest, like she'd been expecting this visit. Ngozi ordered jollof rice and plantain, paid, and sat down at one of the benches. The plate arrived, steaming and fragrant. The rice was a deep orange red, the plantain golden and perfectly fried. Ngozi picked up her spoon, hesitated for just a moment, then took a bite. And in that instant, she understood everything. The taste was beyond anything she could describe. It wasn't just delicious, it was overwhelming, intoxicating, like every flavor she'd ever loved condensed into a single mouthful. Her mind went quiet. Her worries dissolved. All she could think about was the next bite, and the next, and the next. She finished the entire plate in minutes, barely breathing between mouthfuls. When it was gone, she sat there staring at the empty plate, feeling a strange emptiness that had nothing to do with hunger. She wanted more. She needed more. And that terrified her. Ngozi left the stall in a daze, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. She walked home slowly, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how food, just ordinary food, could make her feel that way. When she got home, she went straight to the bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked back at her, and she barely recognized the desperation in her own eyes. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. Something was wrong with Grace's food, something that went beyond seasoning or cooking technique. That evening, Ngozi went to visit her friend Amara, a retired nurse who had lived in Ugwoba her entire life, 73 years of watching the village grow and change. Amara listened to Ngozi's story without interrupting, her weathered face thoughtful, her eyes knowing. When Ngozi finished, Amara was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and spoke in a low voice, barely above a whisper. There are things, she said, that our grandmothers knew about. Old practices, dark practices. Women who wanted power over men, women who wanted money or influence, they would do things that shouldn't be spoken of in daylight. They would use their bodies in ways that violated everything sacred, mixing fluids that were meant to remain private into food, into drinks, believing it would bind people to them, make them obsessed, make them unable to resist. Ngozi felt her stomach turn. She wanted to dismiss it as superstition, as old wives' tales that belonged to a different era. But she couldn't. Not when her husband looked like a ghost of himself. Not when the entire village was falling apart. Not when she herself had felt that unnatural pull, that craving that went beyond taste or satisfaction. Amara continued, her voice heavy with sadness. "I've seen this before," she said. "Not here, but in my mother's village when I was a young girl. A woman did the same thing. She cooked for the men, and they became like animals, fighting over her food, spending everything they had, abandoning their families. When the truth came out, the village almost tore itself apart. Some wanted to kill her. Others wanted to protect her. In the end, she just disappeared one night, and nobody ever spoke her name again. But the damage was done. Marriages ended. Children grew up without fathers. The village never fully recovered. Ngozi listened, her blood running cold, her mind racing. If this was true, if Grace was really doing what Amara suggested, then they had to stop her. But how? How do you prove something like that? How do you accuse someone without evidence, without sounding insane? That night, Ngozi made a decision. A dangerous decision. She would watch Grace. Not from distance, but up close. She would find out where the flavor came from, where the secret ingredient was hidden, what Grace was really putting in those pots. So for the next 3 days, Ngozi became a shadow. She'd go to the market early in the morning, before the stalls opened, and position herself behind empty vendor tables where she could see Grace's cooking area. She'd watch as Grace arrived, always alone, always carrying the same large covered pot, always moving with that same unhurried precision. Grace would set up her station, arrange her ingredients, light the firewood, and begin cooking. But something was off. Ngozi noticed that Grace never fetched water from the communal borehole like the other vendors did. She never sent anyone to buy palm oil in the quantities that would match the amount of food she prepared daily. In fact, Grace barely bought anything at all. Just rice. Just tomatoes and peppers. The basics. So where was everything else coming from? Where was the stock, the seasoning, the depth of flavor that made her food so addictive? On the 4th night, Ngozi decided to stay late to watch what Grace did after the market closed, when everyone else had gone home. She hid behind a cluster of empty stalls, crouching in the shadows, her heart hammering in her chest. The market was eerily quiet, just the sound of crickets and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Grace finished serving her last customer around 7, then began cleaning up. She scraped the pots, stacked them, swept the cooking area. Normal things. Ordinary things. But then, around 8 o'clock, when the market was completely deserted, Grace did something strange. She locked the small wooden door that led to her cooking area, pulled out a large metal basin, and placed it on the ground. Ngozi squinted through the darkness, her pulse racing. Grace looked around carefully, scanning the empty market, making sure she was alone. Then she lifted her wrapper, positioned herself over the basin, and squatted. Ngozi's breath caught in her throat. She watched, frozen, as Grace relieved herself into the basin. But it wasn't urine. It was something else. Something thicker, darker, something that came from a place that should never, ever be connected to food. Ngozi's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her entire body went cold. She wanted to look away, wanted to run, but she couldn't move. She just stared, horrified, as Grace finished, stood up, adjusted her wrapper, and then, with a small ladle, began transferring the contents of the basin into a covered pot. The same pot she brought to the market every morning. The same pot she used to cook. Ngozi's stomach heaved. She stumbled backward, knocking over an empty crate. The noise echoed through the silent market like a gunshot. Grace's head snapped up. Her eyes locked on Ngozi's hiding spot. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stared at each other across the darkness, predator and prey, secret and witness. Then Grace smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not an embarrassed smile. A knowing smile. A smile that said, "Now you know, and what you gonna do about it?" Ngozi ran. She ran faster than she'd ever run in her life, her lungs burning, her legs screaming, tears streaming down her face. She ran all the way to Amara's house and pounded on the door until the old woman opened it, alarmed. Ngozi collapsed in the doorway, sobbing, gasping, tried to form words but only managing broken sounds. Amara pulled her inside, sat her down, brought her water, waited for her to calm down. When Ngozi finally told her what she'd seen, Amara's face went pale. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, something old, something in Igbo that Ngozi didn't fully understand. Then Amara said, "We have to tell the elders. Tonight. This cannot wait until morning. Because if people find out on their own, if this spreads as gossip before the truth is properly revealed, there will be violence. There will be blood. The village will tear itself apart." They went to Chief Okonkwo's compound immediately. The chief was preparing for bed, but when he saw the look on their faces, he knew something terrible had happened. They told him everything. At first, he didn't want to believe it. Grace was a quiet woman, a widow, someone who'd come to their village seeking refuge. How could she do something so vile, so unthinkable? But Amara reminded him of the stories, the old stories, the warnings passed down through generations about women who used their bodies as weapons, who mixed shame with sustenance, who turned food into chains. Chief Okonkwo sat in silence for a long time, his face grave, his hands trembling slightly. Then he stood up and said, "We will confront her tomorrow, but we will do it properly. We will bring witnesses. We will bring the pastor. We will bring the market chairman, and we will give her a chance to defend herself, though I suspect she will have no defense worth hearing." The next morning, Chief Okonkwo assembled a group of trusted men and women. Pastor Emeka, the market chairman, Amara, 2 other village elders, and a few witnesses, including Ngozi. They arrived at Grace's stall just as she was setting up for the day. The market was already filling with customers, people lining up with their empty plates, eyes hungry and eager. Chief Okonkwo raised his hand for silence. The crowd quieted, sensing something important was about to happen. The chief stepped forward and addressed Grace directly. He asked her, in front of everyone, to explain where she got her water, where she got her ingredients, where the flavor in her food came from. Grace didn't answer. She just kept stirring her pot, her face calm, almost serene. Pastor Emeka stepped forward and asked her to open the covered pot she kept in the corner, the one she never let anyone touch. Grace's hand stopped stirring. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Fear? Anger? It was hard to tell, but she didn't move to open the pot. The market chairman, a man named Mr. Ease, stepped forward and opened it himself. The smell that rose from that pot was unlike anything anyone had ever encountered. It wasn't rotten, but it wasn't clean either. It was organic, human, unmistakable. Mr. Ease stumbled backward, his face twisted in disgust. Pastor Emeka looked inside, then immediately turned away, his hand over his mouth. Chief Okonkwo peered in, and his expression went from confusion to horror to rage in a matter of seconds. The crowd pressed closer, trying to see, trying to understand. And when the truth finally registered, when people realized what they'd been eating for months, the market erupted. Screams, cries, people vomiting in the streets, mothers grabbing their children and running, men standing frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some people collapsed. Some people wept. Some people just stared at Grace, unable to process that a human being could do something so monstrous. Grace stood in the center of it all, still calm, still silent. Someone shouted, "Why? Why would you do this?" Grace finally spoke, her voice flat, emotionless. She said, "You all wanted something you couldn't get anywhere else. You wanted to feel satisfied. You wanted to feel full. I gave you what you wanted. You kept coming back. Nobody forced you." Another voice shouted, "You poisoned us." Grace shook her head slowly. "I didn't poison anyone. You're all still alive. You're all still healthy. You just can't handle the truth of what you consumed. But you consumed it willingly. You paid for it. You praised it. You couldn't get enough of it. So who is really to blame here?" The crowd surged forward, anger overcoming shock. Chief Okonkwo stepped between them and Grace, his arms raised. No violence, he shouted. We are not animals. We will not become what she is. Grace will leave this village today, and she will never return. If she does, we will hand her to the authorities. But right now, we will let her go, because we are better than this. We are better than her. Grace gathered her things slowly, deliberately. She packed her pots, folded her wrapper, and slung her bag over her shoulder. She walked through the market, through the crowd of people who parted silently to let her pass, their faces filled with disgust and betrayal, and something else, something that looked almost like shame. Because deep down, they knew she was right about one thing. They had come back. They had paid. They had praised her cooking. They had ignored the warning signs, the red flags, the quiet voice in their heads that said something wasn't right. They had chosen satisfaction over scrutiny, and now they had to live with that choice. Grace walked down the red dirt road that led out of Agwoba, her head high, her back straight, never once looking back. Some say she went to Abi Estate. Some say she's in Delta, doing the same thing under a different name. Some say she was seen in a market in Asaba 6 months later, cooking again, drawing crowds again. No one knows for sure, but the fear remains. The suspicion remains. Because if it happened once, it can happen again. The aftermath was devastating. Marcus locked himself in his room for 3 days straight. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, wouldn't look at anyone. When he finally emerged, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. The shame was written all over his face, carved into the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw. Ngozi tried to comfort him, but he couldn't accept it. He felt like he'd betrayed her, betrayed his children, betrayed himself. How do you come back from that? How do you forgive yourself for being so weak, so blind, so easily manipulated? Chitty, the civil servant who'd spent his entire salary, lost his job because he couldn't pay back the money he'd borrowed from colleagues. Oluchi, the university student, failed all her exams and had to repeat the year. Pastor Emeka stepped down from his position, claiming he was no longer worthy to lead, that he'd failed his congregation by failing himself. How do you look at food the same way again, knowing what it can hide, what it can carry, what it can do? The answer, they discovered, was time. Slow, painful, agonizing time. Ngozi and Marcus went to counseling with Pastor Emeka before he stepped down. It wasn't easy. There were nights Ngozi cried until she had no tears left. Nights Marcus sat in silence, staring at the wall, unable to articulate the depth of his regret. But they stayed. They fought. And slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. Not back to what they were. That was impossible, but into something new, something harder, something more honest. Marcus started eating Ngozi's cooking again, though it took him weeks to finish a full plate without feeling nauseous. Not because the food was bad, but because eating itself had become traumatic, a reminder of how thoroughly he'd been deceived. Amara started a support group for the women of the village, a place where they could talk openly about what had happened without judgment, without shame. They met every Thursday evening in the church hall, sometimes a dozen women, sometimes more. They talked about their husbands, their children, their own feelings of betrayal and confusion. They talked about how to recognize manipulation, how to trust their instincts, how to ask questions even when it felt uncomfortable. Slowly, the village began to change. People became more cautious, more skeptical, more willing to interrogate things that seemed too good to be true. The other food vendors returned to the market, but their businesses never fully recovered. People cooked at home more. They bought raw ingredients and prepared their own meals, even if it took longer, even if it was less convenient. Because convenience, they learned, sometimes comes at a price too high to pay. 6 months later, a new vendor tried to set up a food stall in the market. She was young, friendly, and her food smelled amazing. But nobody bought from her. Not a single plate. The woman packed up after 3 days, confused and frustrated. Chief Okonkwo went to speak with her before she left. He explained gently what had happened. He told her it wasn't personal, that she'd done nothing wrong, but that the village had been wounded in a way that would take years to heal. The woman listened, her eyes wide, and then she left, shaking her head in disbelief. But for the people of Agwoba, it wasn't disbelief. It was survival. It was protection. It was a refusal to ever be fooled again. Today, if you visit Agwoba, you won't see Grace's stall. The spot where it stood has been left empty, a deliberate choice by the market chairman. No one is allowed to set up there. It's become an unofficial memorial, a reminder etched into the very landscape of the village. Children ask their parents why that space is always empty, and the parents tell them story. Not the full story, not the graphic details, but enough. Enough to teach them to question. Enough to teach them to value discernment over desire. Enough to teach them that some hungers are not meant to be fed. The elders still gather in the evenings, and sometimes, when the conversation turns serious, they'll mention Grace's name in hushed tones. They'll talk about the signs they missed, the red flags they ignored, the collective madness that gripped the entire village. And they'll remind whoever is listening that wisdom is learned through pain, that discernment is earned through failure, that the sweetest poison is always wrapped in the most beautiful package. So let me ask you, because this question matters, because this story matters, how would you feel if you discovered you'd been consuming something like this for months, maybe even years? What would you do if someone you trusted, someone whose cooking you praised, whose skill you admired, had been deceiving you in the most intimate, most violating way possible? Could you forgive yourself for not seeing the signs? Could you forgive others for falling into the same trap? And more importantly, how do you rebuild trust after it's been shattered so completely? These aren't easy questions, and there are no easy answers. But they're questions worth asking. Because Grace's story, as horrifying as it is, isn't just about one woman in one village in Nigeria. It's about all of us. It's about the things we consume without questioning. It's about the people we trust without verifying. It's about the cravings we feed without understanding where they come from or what they cost. It's about the willingness to trade discernment for satisfaction, caution for convenience, wisdom for pleasure. And that trade, as the people of Agwoba learned, always comes with a price. The truth is, we're all vulnerable to this. Maybe not in the exact same way, maybe not with food, but with something. Maybe it's a relationship that feels too perfect, too intense, too consuming. Maybe it's a business opportunity that promises too much, too quickly, too easily. Maybe it's a substance, a habit, a pattern that makes us feel good in the moment, but slowly erodes who we are. We all have our version of Grace's stall. We all have something that pulls us in, that quiets our questions, that makes us ignore the warning signs. And a lesson from Agwoba is simple but profound. Stop and ask questions. Trust your instincts. Value discernment over desire. Because the moment you stop questioning is the moment you become vulnerable. And once you're vulnerable, once you're hooked, once you're in too deep, getting out becomes exponentially harder. African stories are not just tales to pass the time. They're warnings carved into our collective memory. They're lessons learned through suffering so that others don't have to suffer the same way. They're mirrors held up to our own choices, our own weaknesses, our own capacity for self-deception. If you want more stories like this, stories that challenge you, that make you think, that force you to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the choices we make, then subscribe to this channel. Because we're not here to entertain you with fairy tales. We're here to remind you that the darkest stories are often the truest ones, and the truest ones are the ones we need to hear the most. So subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, remember Agwoba. Remember Grace. Remember what happens when an entire community stops asking questions. And make sure it never happens to you.